The CEO saw him draw 3 circles on the concrete floor, and everyone in the factory laughed. 7 minutes later, the dead engine roared back to life so loudly that the entire building fell silent. The giant testing warehouse in Dallas was filled with tension that morning. Engineers in expensive suits stood beside a multi-million-dollar industrial engine that had refused to start for 6 straight weeks. Investors were arriving in less than an hour. Reporters were already outside the gates. One public failure could destroy the company's reputation overnight. At the center of the chaos stood Marissa Vale, the young CEO of Titan Core Motors. Her hands trembled as she stared at the frozen machine. The company had invested everything into that engine. If it failed today, hundreds of workers could lose their jobs. She had not slept properly in days. The pressure in her chest felt heavier than steel. Then she noticed the janitor. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, wearing faded work boots and pushing a cleaning cart near the back wall. His gray shirt carried oil stains that looked years old. Most employees barely noticed him. Some didn't even know his name. But he was watching the engine carefully. Not casually. Not curiously. He was studying it. If you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Unlimited. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the people the world ignores carry the wisdom that can change everything. The engineers continued arguing while Marissa rubbed her forehead in frustration. Diagnostic screens flashed red across the room. Nobody could figure out why the ignition timing kept collapsing during startup. They had replaced sensors, rebuilt fuel lines, and rewritten software. Nothing worked. Then the janitor quietly walked closer. His name was Gideon Rusk. One of the engineers immediately snapped at him, telling him to stay away from the equipment. A few others smirked. To them, he was just an old maintenance worker wondering where he didn't belong. But Gideon kept staring at the engine. Marissa noticed something strange in his eyes. Recognition. Not confusion. Recognition. She was desperate enough to ask if he saw something everyone else missed. The room grew awkwardly quiet. Gideon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he grabbed a small piece of chalk from a nearby toolbox and slowly walked toward the floor beneath the engine platform. Without saying much, he knelt down and carefully drew 3 large circles on the concrete floor. The engineers exchanged amused looks. Someone laughed openly. Another whispered that stress must have made the CEO lose her mind. But Gideon ignored them. He studied the circles for several seconds, then walked around the engine slowly, listening to the ticking sounds inside the metal casing like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. Marissa watched every movement carefully. Something about him felt different now. Not weak. Not lost. Experienced. Gideon finally pointed toward a hidden junction beneath the fuel regulator and calmly explained that the vibration pattern was wrong. He believed the startup pressure was creating microscopic air pockets inside the feed chamber. The engine itself wasn't dead. It was suffocating before ignition could stabilize. The engineers immediately objected. They insisted their software models already ruled that out weeks ago. But Gideon quietly replied that software could not always hear fear inside metal. The sentence confused everyone. Except Marissa. Because somehow, deep down, she understood exactly what he meant. The CEO ordered the team to test his theory. Reluctantly, the engineers opened the lower chamber while Gideon stood silently beside the chalk circles. He instructed them to slightly rotate the pressure valves in a sequence no one had considered before. The room filled with skepticism. Every second felt heavier. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Rain hit the factory windows in violent waves. Then the countdown began. 7 minutes after Gideon drew those circles, the engine suddenly trembled. A deep metallic rumble echoed through the warehouse. One light turned green. Then another. The massive engine exploded to life with a deafening roar that shook the entire building. Everyone froze. The impossible had happened. The same engineers who mocked him stared in complete disbelief as the machine stabilized perfectly for the first time in weeks. Smoke cleared through the ceiling vents while the system monitors flashed successful startup readings across every screen. Marissa felt tears rise in her eyes. Not because the engine worked. Because she suddenly realized who Gideon truly was. Years earlier, before Titan Core even existed, Gideon Rusk had been one of the most respected mechanical engineers in the country. He helped design emergency turbine systems that saved factories after catastrophic failures. But after losing his wife and young son in a highway accident, he disappeared from the industry entirely. Grief destroyed him. He lost his career, his home, his confidence. Eventually, he took quiet maintenance jobs where nobody asked questions. And somehow, life had brought him here. Marissa later discovered that Gideon had applied for engineering positions many times over the years, but companies rejected him because of his age, his long employment gap, and his worn appearance. Nobody looked beyond the surface. Nobody cared enough to ask about the men beneath the uniform. That realization broke something inside her. Because just an hour earlier, she herself had almost ignored him too. The investors arrived expecting disaster but instead witnessed the engine performing flawlessly. Titan Core's stock surged by evening. News of the miraculous recovery spread across the industry within hours. But the moment Marissa remembered most happened later that night. Long after the reporters left. Long after the celebrations ended. She found Gideon alone in the empty warehouse quietly erasing the 3 chalk circles from the floor. As if none of it mattered. As if he still believed he was invisible. Marissa walked toward him with tears in her eyes and offered him a permanent position as lead systems advisor for the company. Gideon stood silently for several seconds before lowering his head, overwhelmed by emotion he had buried for years. For the first time in a very long time, someone had seen value in him again. Not pity. Not charity. Value. The next morning, workers across the factory greeted Gideon differently. The same people who once ignored him now stopped to shake his hand. Younger engineers followed him through the warehouse carrying notebooks, eager to learn from him. But Gideon remained humble. He never bragged about what happened. Instead, he spent his days teaching others that machines, like people, often fail quietly long before they completely break. And sometimes the solution is not replacing everything. Sometimes it is simply listening carefully enough to understand what is hurting beneath the surface. Months later, Titan Core placed 3 small bronze circles in the concrete floor beneath the restored engine as a permanent reminder of that day. Not to honor a machine, but to honor the men everyone overlooked. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that every person deserves dignity, respect, and a second chance. And before this story ends, comment below, invisible people matter too. Because somewhere out there tonight, someone feels forgotten, while carrying the wisdom that could change the world. Marissa would later say that saving the engine was not the greatest miracle she witnessed that day. The real miracle was watching a broken man slowly remember his worth again. And in the bright daylight pouring through the factory windows, while machines thundered back to life around him, Gideon Rusk finally stopped feeling invisible.